Well, we went to, thought we'd bring in a person from the Hall of Fame to speak to us today. So we have Craig Muter with us. Craig is with the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and I'm going to read the introduction because I'm sorry I didn't commit it to memory. He's been there since 2008 as Director of Communications, and his job includes managing the Hall's publication projects, editorial calendars, content distribution, and of course, media relations type of work that he does. He's a native of Hubbard, Ohio, somewhere about halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh out there, and he graduated from Kent State University in 1991 and embarked on a 17-year career in newspapers as a sports writer and an editor. He's a lifelong baseball fan and covered the Hall of Fame induction ceremonies and other museum events from 98 through 08, and when he was in Utica, and now his wife, and I suppose landed your dream job in there, and think that's what a great place to land. Craig and his wife live in New Hartford, New York, and they have 2 adult daughters. And Craig, looking forward to hearing from you and having you tell us about the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for having me here with Rotary. We have a very active Rotary Club in Cooperstown that do some great things too. So I'm familiar with a lot of the things that just happened with Happy Bucks and things like that. It was great to see you guys do that. All right, well, you've already told me that some of you have been to the Hall of Fame before. And as you said, Cooperstown's not an easy place to get to. So the first question we always get from visitors is, why are we in Cooperstown? Why is the Hall of Fame here? Why aren't we in Long Beach, California, or Providence, Rhode Island, or anywhere else? So here's the short answer to that question, as short as we can get it. In 1905, the powers that be in baseball, the owners, decided they wanted to know where baseball came from. And as I tell student groups who come through the Hall of Fame every year, believe it or not, in 1905, there was no internet. You're not typing to Google, where did baseball come from, and get your answer. So they used the 1905 equivalent of the internet, which was newspapers. They sent out thousands of classified advertisements to papers all over the country. Basically a little two-sentence item that said, if you know where baseball started or how baseball started, write us a letter and tell us. And the reason they were doing this was there was a raging debate at the time about whether baseball was purely an American sport, played only in America, or whether it had evolved from other classic stick and ball games like cricket. So about 2 years later, in 1907, a mining engineer living in Colorado named Abner Graves sees one of these little ads in his local paper and writes a letter to the editor to the Akron Beacon Journal, paper located outside of Cleveland, Ohio, still exists today. And he says, yeah, I know how baseball got started. In 1839, Graves wrote, I was a boy of 5 years old living in Cooperstown, New York, and I watched as Abner Doubleday was commanding a Union Army regiment that was encamped in Cooperstown doing its maneuvers. And Doubleday laid out the bases in a field for recreation for his soldiers on their downtime. And that, according to Abner Graves, is how baseball began. And when the owners read this, they absolutely loved it. Because at the time, Doubleday had no known connection to baseball. What he was a very famous Civil War general. He fired the first shot in defense of the Union at the start of the American Civil War in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and then was later very prevalent in the Battle of Gettysburg. So this was an American hero, a man who in 1907, everyone would know off the top of their head as an American hero. And as far as the owners were concerned, there was another great thing about Doubleday. He was dead. So you couldn't go ask him if he invented the game of baseball because he wasn't around to answer the question anymore. So the owners said, yes, an American hero invented our game in Cooperstown in 1839, and we really don't want to know anymore. So they published a little 30-page paper saying, to the best of our knowledge, this is what happened. They put it on a shelf, and there it sat. Now, fast forward about 15 years into the 1920s, and Babe Ruth comes on the scene as a hitter with the New York Yankees. And at that point, baseball transitions from the national pastime, which it was even in 1907, it now becomes a national obsession. If you were a sports fan living in America in the 1920s, you were a baseball fan. There was a little bit of college football, a little bit of pro boxing, but mostly it was baseball. So this myth that Doubleday invented the game in Cooperstown began to take root. Remember that word myth. I'll get back to it in a minute. So now fast forward in the 1930s. There's a man living in Cooperstown named Stephen Clark, and he is the heir to the Singer Sewing Machine Corporation. He has two great passions in his life, the village of Cooperstown and baseball. And he's very worried about the future of the village at that point, the economic future, because the economy in Cooperstown in the 1930s was dying. And the economy in Cooperstown in the 1930s was based on, as you might guess, farming, specifically the growing of hops for the production of beer. Anheuser-Busch owned a lot of land in Cooperstown, still owns land in Cooperstown, but they were in the process of moving their operation out to the Midwest for a number of reasons. And this concerned Mr. Clark. He thought, hey, if Busch leaves, then the farmers are going to leave. They're just going to follow him and plant their hops wherever he is. And if the farmers leave, well, that's the end of the village. Cooperstown ceases to exist. And this was a very famous place long before baseball got here. A man named James Fenimore Cooper, the village's namesake, lived here, wrote here, published a book here called The Last of the Mohicans. It's considered the first great novel in American history. So Mr. Clark didn't want to see all that history die, and he hit upon the idea of tourism as an economic driver, specifically opening a museum to celebrate baseball centennial, which would be 1939 if Doubleday invented the game in 1839. So Mr. Clark writes a letter to a man he knows named Ford Frick, who at the time is the president of the National League and is later the commissioner of baseball. And he says, hey, if we open a museum to celebrate baseball centennial, will you help us stock it by getting players to give us things like bats and balls and gloves so tourists will come see it? Frick said, yeah, we love that idea, provided that one element of your museum is a Hall of Fame. We can honor the best of the best who've ever played the game. Mr. Clark said, yeah, we love it. We're going to do it. So in 1936, the Baseball Writers Association of America elected the first Hall of Fame class. Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, Ty Cobb, Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson, the first five. Not a bad five. And then 3 years later, on June 12th, 1939, we opened our doors to the museum for the first time. Pretty much a one-room building. It still exists. It's just a ticket booth is there now. It's enclosed by other buildings. And we've expanded about 5 times since 1939. Now, by the time lunch rolls around today, and maybe before that, you're not going to remember me or most of what I just said, but you got to promise me you remember this one for the rest of your life. Doubleday did not invent baseball in Cooperstown. Okay, it was a myth. It was a story. Never happened. Abner Graves made it up as a way to honor a man he considered an American hero. Baseball is not invented by any one person at any one time. It evolved over many, many decades, with kids playing with sticks and balls in rural areas like Cooperstown, but also from classic English bat and ball games like cricket and rounders and a game named stool ball, and even an Americanized version of that game called One Old Cat. Now, if you get in a time machine, get in a DeLorean with Doc Brown and go back to about 1840 in this country, in the New York City area, you'd get out and you'd look over there and you'd say, hey, I know what those guys are doing over there. They're playing baseball. And that's really when the game started to congeal, around the 1840s. And what really pushed it, what really made it happen, was the innovation of train travel. Prior to the 1830s, people didn't leave where they were. Where you were born, you lived within 10 miles of where you were born, and then you died, and you didn't go anywhere else. The advent of train travel took people around this country. And when they started traveling, they noticed that people were playing these bat and ball games that they were playing, but there was a little difference to them. And so what they do is they say, well, we want to play a game, but we got to agree on what the rules are. So they would sit down and literally write down the rules. They'd say, okay, now we're going to agree. There are 9 guys per side, and there are 3 outs per inning, and the bases are this far apart, and so on. Once they did that multiple times and kept writing it down, the game coalesced into what we now know as the sport. Really, in the 1850s, it really started to take root in athletic clubs in the New York City area. Yeah, if you were of means back then, which means you could afford recreation, you belonged to these athletic clubs that were almost like college fraternities. You'd pay dues to join the club, and then you'd play games against other clubs. And one of the games they started playing was baseball. And again, they'd write the rules down over and over again, and it became more and more popular. Then the American Civil War happens. So these men who are in these athletic clubs or even playing the game at home join the military, and they take the game all over the country, playing it on their downtime. We have photos of Civil War posts where you see the soldiers in front, and in back, you can tell the people are playing baseball in these Civil War camps. So this is a very old game that dates back well before the 1839 in this country, because it was played well before that. Now, when these folks come back from the Civil War ends in 1865. When they come back, baseball's popularity explodes. So the American Civil War ends in 1865. By 1869, 4 years later, you have the creation of the Cincinnati Red Stockings, the first professional team in the history of this country. Now, they didn't play in a league. They played against other amateur teams. But what their owner figured out was if they paid the players, they'd get the best players on their team and they'd win all their games, which is exactly what happened. 2 years after that, in 1871, you have the creation of the National Association, which is the first league of pro teams in this country. Most of the players on that Cincinnati team went to play for the Boston team in that league. And then in 1876, you have the creation of the National League, the same National League that the Pirates and the Dodgers play in today. This is a very, very old game and was not invented in Cooperstown. Really, it's a happy accident. We are very fortunate that we have this thing that says Cooperstown is baseball's home, because it's where the pulse of the game beats the strongest. So that's why we're in Cooperstown. Now, this is who we are. We're the Hall of Fame, but we're really three institutions under one roof called the Hall of Fame. The first is the Hall of Fame, the 333 men and women who are enshrined as the best of the best in the history of this game. Of those 333, 263 of them are former big league baseball players. The rest are managers, umpires, executives, and pre-Negro Leaguers, folks who played before the advent of the Negro League started in 1920. So 263 former big leaguers. As of today, there are about 19,900 men who've ever played at least one inning of Major League Baseball. 19,900. That's it. You couldn't fill up Madison Square Garden in New York City one time with fans for one basketball game with the amount of people who've ever played big league baseball. Just to get to the major leagues is a miracle. All right. And then to get to the Hall of Fame, well, do the math. 263 Hall of Famers in the big leagues out of about 19,900. It's a little more than 1%, or literally 1% of the miracle. That's why election to the Hall of Fame truly is the greatest honor in all of sport. So we're the Hall of Fame. That's number one. We're a history museum. That's number two. Mr. Clark's vision for us came to be. We have over 40,000 artifacts in our collection: bats, balls, gloves, and spikes. When you walk through the museum, you see about 10%, about 4,500 on display at any given time. The rest are kept in climate-controlled areas for a couple reasons. Number one, Cooperstown's a very small village. We're not getting any bigger, and we don't have room for 40,000 artifacts in the building. But number two, and much more important, everything that we have, everything you see when you come visit us, is given to us, is donated to us. We don't buy or sell anything. And in exchange for that donation, when Mike Trout walked off the field at the All-Star game in Cincinnati in 2015, and he gave us his bat, and he says, "Here, I want you to have this bat." We promised Mike Trout that we're going to keep that bat. We're going to preserve that bat forever. And just yesterday, our curatorial team was kind enough to inform me that forever is a really long time. Realistically, they want us to keep anything we ever get intact for at least 200 years. Now, 200 years is an easy figure for us to throw out here when we're sitting here today. But can you tell me this? Who was president of the United States 200 years ago today, on April 20th, 1821? Anybody got the answer? Sorry, Alex says time is up. We'll have to buzz you out. It was James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States, and one of our founding fathers was president 200 years ago today. That's a long time to keep anything intact. And it's not enough just to keep it inside out of the rain and think it's going to be around in 200 years. If you took a wooden bat and leaned it up against a corner in whatever room you're sitting in, and you came back in about 50 years, that bat would be cracked and probably split in half, because what happens is there's changes in temperature and humidity in any room or any building, depending on what the weather's doing outside and how many people are in the building. And when you have changes in temperature and humidity, the bat or a desk or anything you have goes like this. It expands and contracts on a very small basis. It's kind of like the road outside your house. And I'm sure you can relate to this, because we can relate to it in Cooperstown. In the spring, when it gets warm and it gets cold and the road expands and contracts, you get these potholes in the road. Well, that's the same thing with the artifacts. You get tiny little potholes in the artifacts, and it starts to break down the integrity of the piece. The problem is we can't have potholes in the artifacts, because they're not making any more Babe Ruth bats, and they're not making any more Ty Cobb jerseys. The ones we have are it. We've got to protect them for as long as we can, so that in 50 years, I'm not going to be here, but the 2071 version of me is going to be here, and he or she is going to come out and say, hey, look at this Mike Trout bat. This is from the 2015 All-Star game. He was the first guy ever to win back-to-back All-Star MVPs, and probably by that point, he's certainly a Hall of Famer. This is a piece of history. That's what we're charged with doing as a history museum. And so what the curators do is, in the winter, when the tourist season is low, they will take new artifacts and put them on exhibit, and take the old artifacts and put them in the climate-controlled facility where the temperature and humidity doesn't change, so that they don't expand and contract as much. And that preserves them for as long as possible. Plus, when you come and see us again in 5 years, you see a different museum than the one you saw today. So we're the Hall of Fame, that's number one. We're a history museum, that's number two. Number three, we're an educational facility. We have over 3 million documents in our library, the biggest baseball library in the world, ranging from a player file, and everybody's ever played Major League Baseball, so all 19,900 men have a newspaper clippings file in our library, ranging from that to very unique documents like the Green Light Letter, which was a letter that President Franklin Roosevelt wrote to the Commissioner of Baseball in January of 1942, right at the dawn of World War II. And he said, keep baseball going during the war, because it's important to the country's morale. We have that document along with countless others like it. And what we use them to do is educate folks, not just students, but everybody, about how important this game is to this country. Baseball in the United States grew up together. There's hardly any other institution, and there's no other sport that can make that claim. And as a result, people in this country feel very protective of the game of baseball. And I'll give you a couple examples of how that works. Who saw the movie 42 a couple of years ago that talked about Jackie Robinson's first big league season? Great flick, one of my favorites. April 15th, 1947, Jackie Robinson becomes the first African-American player to appear in a modern big league baseball game. That's 7 full years before Brown versus Board of Education, which is a landmark civil rights case in the history of this country's Supreme Court. Baseball was not only reflecting history, it was making history. It was changing history. This is why people today feel very protective of it as an institution. Example number two is much more recent. Probably some of you remember it. July 22nd, 2013. On that day, Milwaukee Brewers outfielder Ryan Braun is suspended for 65 games, the rest of their season, for performance-enhancing drug use. You couldn't go anywhere in the media that day, radio, TV, internet, without seeing or hearing about Ryan Braun. News or sports, it was the story of the day in America that day. That same day, July 22nd, 2013, a linebacker for the NFL's Denver Broncos, a Pro Bowl linebacker who just won the Super Bowl MVP a couple years ago, Von Miller, gets suspended for 4 games, about a quarter of their season, for performance-enhancing drug use. And nobody cared. And it's not because the NFL isn't wildly popular in this country, because it is. It's because baseball is supposed to be about something different. Baseball is supposed to be about something better. And every time anybody walks on that baseball diamond, that's the expectation they have on their shoulders. They're going to play the game right, and they're going to play the game fair. It's a lot of responsibility, it really is. But it's also a lot of fun, because they truly are playing this country's national pastime. We at the Baseball Hall of Fame work very closely with Major League Baseball, but we are not owned or operated by MLB. We are an independent, not-for-profit history museum much like the Smithsonian or any other museums across this country. We have members and we have donors, and that's how we support ourselves, so that in 200 years, we'll still be around talking about this game that I guarantee you'll be around even then. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my little introduction to the Hall of Fame. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to field them. You want to ask me about Pete Rose and Barry Bonds, I'll take my best shot. Or if you want to ask me about the Tigers, they play my Pirates tonight, so I'm looking forward to the game tonight. Fire away.
Pick me. Couple of quick questions. First, two of them, Craig. First, how has the pandemic impacted like revenue and all of that for the Hall of Fame, and has that created challenges for you? And then second, sentimentally, what's your favorite artifact in the National Baseball Hall of Fame Museum?
So yes, the pandemic has obviously our attendance has been reduced significantly. We're at a 25% capacity level right now, and in fact, next Monday, the New York governor just announced we're going up to 50%. So that's a big step. That's a tremendous amount. That's a good quarter or more of our annual revenue. We are very fortunate that we have donors who have supported us throughout this pandemic and helped. We have it's a challenging situation, but one we're committed to seeing through. And we are hopeful that as the pandemic eases here, that tourism is going to start up again, and we're going to be able to resume and get back to where we were. As for the second question, my favorite artifact is it's an interesting answer. So when I was growing up, by the time I was 12 years old, I realized I was not going to be Willie Mays, that I did not have those gifts, and I loved baseball. I started reading baseball encyclopedias and baseball stories when I was 10 or 11. My parents got me a Neff and Cohen World Series encyclopedia for Christmas in 1979. I devoured that, and I very quickly found out that I had memorized all the World Series results, just kind of accidentally. And I just fell in love with the game, and I knew I was not going to be able to play the game for a living. That was not going to happen. So I thought, well, I'll have to find another way. And I ended up getting the newspapers and was very fortunate to land at the Hall of Fame. But as I read those baseball books, you picture things in your mind. So you're reading encyclopedias, and as I'm going through them, and if you're familiar with the Philadelphia, history of the Oakland Athletics, I used to be in Philadelphia. And they won 3 straight AL pennants and 2 World Series from 1929 to 1931. And their first baseman was a guy named Jimmy Fox, who is now a Hall of Famer. He's one of the best hitters of all time. And for whatever reason, probably because the A's now dress in green, I just pictured Jimmy Fox and the rest of the A's in green uniforms. And then I get to the Hall of Fame, and on display, and it's still on display, is this Jimmy Fox cap from 1930 or so. And the A's at that point wore this very royal blue, almost like the Royals or the Dodgers now. And it's this striking blue cap. And when I look at it, I remember that these people were actual human beings. These are not words on a page. This is not some abstract history. These were people doing these things. Every time I see that cap, I think about that. And of course, I think about my baseball encyclopedias. And it just takes me right back.
Thank you, Craig. That was amazing.
You are most welcome.
Thank you. We have time maybe for one more question, if anybody. That was really astounding and very entertaining. You did not even need a presentation.
Do kids still trade baseball cards?
Absolutely. Baseball cards are, in fact, since the pandemic, the value of cards has skyrocketed. People are now investing again in baseball cards. And if you're familiar with the history, up until about 1980, baseball cards were very niche, small market. They marketed them to kids. Some adults bought them. But into the 80s, there was this huge boom because they started having value. People started selling their 1952 Mickey Mantles for these outrageous prices. And so there was this huge boom in the 80s. The companies began mass producing cards, 3 and 4 times the numbers that they had produced before. Plus, there were multiple companies because Topps, what happened was a court case ruled that Topps held a monopoly on baseball cards. That was broken up in the 1980s, and suddenly you had all these different manufacturers. What happened then was the bottom fell out because you had so many cards in the market, it flooded it, and it went down. But kids still collected them and adults still collected them. And now the pandemic has suddenly increased the interest in this, and people have paid unbelievable amounts for baseball cards lately. We have a wonderful exhibit in the museum called Shoebox Treasures, which tells you about the history of cards, and we have over 250,000 cards in the collection.
Wow.
Many of which are on display in Shoebox Treasures. So it is something that has long connected the fans to the game.
Thank you.
Craig, my father was a catcher for the Baltimore Burners. Do you have some of the lesser known teams and leagues?
Yes, absolutely. So not every minor leaguer is represented in the library, but a large number of them are through what the librarians call contract cards. So if you have a player who played in the minor leagues but not in the major leagues, minor league baseball tracked the transactions of every baseball player back into the 1910s and beyond and wrote them down on little index cards. Those were donated to us. And so we have people all the time who walk into our library. Our library almost works like a library in your hometown, except that you can't check out books because our books tend to be artifacts. But you can walk in and do research, and we have these contract cards, and it happens all the time. Folks come to the library and say, hey, my father, my uncle played for this team. Do you have this? And most of the time we do. It's amazing. This game was so popular prior to the advent of television. Almost every local town had a team, an organized team of baseball. This was America's pastime. This is what we did until television, really. And even today, even with the advent of television and all the media that's out there, you still have this history of this game that connects us so much. It's the thread through history, and baseball is one of the strongest in our society.
Very good. Thank you. This was very entertaining and exciting. So thank you so much for joining us today, Craig.
You are welcome, guys. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. Okay.